Hi, I'm Paul Peterson, and this is a course on American government. This is the second part to the introductory lecture. And all we're going to do in this lecture is go through the syllabus so that you can see what the outline of the course is. So if you have a copy of the syllabus with you as you watch this video, it might be helpful. You can see what the readings are. The main reading is going to be The New American Democracy. That's the textbook for the course. It's a book by Morris Fiorina and Bertram Johnson and myself. The various chapters are identified for each of the lectures for the course. But right now I'm just going to go through the main topics and elaborate slightly on what they're all about to give you some kind of a feel for what the whole course is going to be about. The first two lectures are going to be on the Constitution because American government was created by a written Constitution that was enacted into law and affirmed by the voters in 1789. And it's really important to understand that the Constitution had to win an election. A lot of things in American government are driven by elections, and the Constitution is one of them. And we'll see just exactly why it was so important that we understand that the Constitution had to be written in such a way as to win an election. That will explain some of its strengths and a number of its weaknesses as well. Then we're going to turn to American political culture. American political culture is unique, it's extraordinary, it's exceptional, it's different. We don't have socialism in this country, we don't have an aristocracy in this country. We have a set of institutions that divide power, we have a people that's skeptical of power, and we have a culture that's been made up of immigrants. So we're going to talk about how immigrants are a deep part of the American tradition in this lecture. And then we're going to turn to judicial review. Judicial review is when the Supreme Court decides that a law passed by Congress and signed by the President is in fact unconstitutional and is null and void and isn't a law after all. How did the courts acquire this extraordinary power? Why can it be that 9 appointed officials on the Supreme Court have the authority to declare a law passed by our elected branches of government unconstitutional? That's judicial review. Then we're going to move on to federalism. Federalism is another exceptional characteristic of American government. Most countries have a unitary form of government. There's one government that governs the whole country, and they have sovereignty throughout the entire land. We have a system where we have dual sovereigns. We have a national sovereign, the federal government, and we have 50 state sovereigns. Each of the state governments are identified by the courts, even to this very day, as sovereign entities. Now, we had a civil war that settled the question that in the end, the national government is the truly sovereign government. And so what was once a contested issue, which of these two levels of government, the federal or the state, was truly sovereign, has been resolved. But there are still very important powers reserved for the states. And then we're going to look at the modern courts. We're going to look at how our court tradition evolved and why the courts are so important and play such a critical role and what the factions are on the court. We're going to learn about how they interpret the Constitution, and we're going to learn about the key decisions that they have made in modern times. The next lecture is going to be on public opinion. Public opinion is the foundation for much of what government does today. But the study of public opinion is very controversial. Although part of it is scientific. There's a scientific way to gather information about what the public thinks. And we're going to learn about the science of finding out public opinion. But public opinion is difficult to interpret because part of it's an art form. The way you ask the question is going to determine the answer that you get. And there's some ways of asking the question that are better than others. And we're going to look at how the study of public opinion has evolved over time and why it is that some polls today don't really give you the truth about public opinion. After that, we go on to interest groups. Interest groups are everywhere in American politics. We have endless numbers of interest groups. We've got farmers, we've got business groups, we've got labor unions, we've got environmentalist groups, we've got groups representing racial groups and ethnic groups. There's endless numbers of groups active in American politics, all trying to explain, to tell the government what they want and explain to them why their interests are so important and the government should take them into account. It's hard to imagine American government surviving if it didn't have these interest groups to help them out. At the same time, those interest groups can be very narrow, very self-interested, and can bias what the public gets just because some of these groups are more powerful than they should be. So that's a topic we're going to explore. Now, the institution that we rely upon to keep interest groups under control are our political parties. We have two political parties in the United States, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and they usually win all of the elections in modern times. Now, there are third parties and fourth parties and fifth parties, but these two parties, Republicans and Democrats, dominate the picture. We're going to study where they come from, how they developed, how different parties existed in the past and gave way to the Republicans and the Democrats, and why they are so difficult to dislodge. What is there about the American exceptional set of institutions that keeps these two political parties as the dominant force in American politics? Now, there's a new force that has arisen in modern times, and that's the media. The media has always been important, but today it has an influence and a stature beyond what anybody could have imagined 100 years ago. We have all kinds of media. We have the print media, that is the newspapers and the magazines. We have television, we have radio, we have the internet, and the new forms of media are taking over from the old forms. The print forms, the magazines, and the newspapers are disappearing. But does the media have a bias? We're going to see two different kinds of opinions on this. Some people say it does not. It simply reports the news. Other people say it has a slant, it has a bias, and therefore you can't trust the media. The other issue is how influential is the media? We're going to look at some arguments that say the media can tell you what to think about, but they can't really push you as to what you think about that subject. And then other people are saying, no, you're underestimating just how influential the media actually is. And we're going to explore that debate, and we're going to let you folks participate in that debate over the question, just how powerful and how biased is the media? And that naturally leads us to voting and presidential elections. We're going to find out that America is exceptional in that many people do not vote, even though we have more elections than many other countries. And we especially do not vote in our primary elections. In our primary elections, that is to say the elections held by each of the political parties, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, those primary elections have very low voter turnouts, and that has an effect on the people that are selected to lead those parties in the general election. So then we'll also look at the general election, and we're going to spend some special time looking at the 2016 election because it's such an unusual election. It is different from many other elections, and we are going to look at the idiosyncrasies of the 2016 presidential election. Well, after we look at presidential elections, we're going on to congressional elections, because what Congress does is affected by the fact that every member of Congress has to win both a primary election and a general election. And that leads to a very conflictual Congress with deep divisions between the two political parties. It hasn't always been that way. It's more so today than ever before, and we're going to look at the reasons why that has evolved and how congressional elections today have a character they haven't had in the past. Then we're going to turn to the presidency, and we're going to look at the power of the president and what the president actually does in practice. The president is given power, special powers, by the Constitution, but every power that is given to the president, just about, is also given to Congress so that they have a check on presidential power. One of the main themes of the course are the checks and balances built into the American governmental system. The president has power, but it is checked by Congress. Now, this is changing. In modern times, over the last 50 years, we've seen a drift of power away from Congress towards the president, and some of the checks and balances that have been accepted, an accepted part of the American governmental system in the past, have begun to erode away. And some people have expressed a concern about that. We're going to look at those concerns, and we're going to look at the realities of presidential power today. Now, once we've finished looking at presidential power, we look at congressional power, because Congress does have the right to pass laws. Nobody else has a right to pass a law, though presidents have found a substitute for that in the executive order. Congress has the authority to overturn executive orders and write fundamental legislation, though the Supreme Court can declare it unconstitutional. See, these checks and balances keep turning up. But just exactly what is on the minds of members of Congress when they make decisions. And we're going to show how the elections that are held that influence the way in which people come into office also affect the way they operate once they are making decisions. So we're going to look at the internal workings of Congress. The bureaucracy sounds very boring. They are just a big set of institutions that do what they're told. That's not quite the reality. That's the myth. That's not quite the reality. The bureaucracy has its own power. The president tries to control the bureaucracy, but they are too big and too complex to be obedient to just one person. And besides that, the bureaucracy has connections to Congress. And sometimes it's those connections between the bureaucracy and Congress that really drive what is done in government, especially when nobody is looking. So we're going to look at what people call the iron triangles, the interest groups, the bureaucrats, and the key committees on Congress that work together to pass legislation. And we're going to see that the bureaucracy is a very complicated part of the American educational system. Now, after looking at all of the institutions and understanding how the courts work, we're going to turn to substantive policy questions. And none is more important than the question of protecting our civil liberties. How are our civil liberties defined in the Constitution? How does the court decide what the meaning of the Constitution is when it comes to our civil liberties? How have our civil liberties evolved over time? How much influence does public opinion have on our civil liberties? And we're going to find out that that story leads us to the conclusion that our civil liberties belong more in the realm of politics and public opinion and less in the realm of the courts than one ordinarily is led to believe by the newspaper commentary. No less important than our civil liberties are the civil rights of groups that need protection from our courts, especially our racial and ethnic groups. This is a legacy that we have inherited from the past, the slavery that existed up until the time of the Civil War, the segregation that persisted after the Civil War, the segregation that continues down to the present, the lack of equal opportunity available to minority groups, especially to our black citizens. We're going to look at how the courts have tried to modify that and how public opinion has changed and evolved over time and affects the relationships between blacks and whites and other minority groups. So other minority groups also include women, and they also include people with different sexual orientations. And we're going to look at how those, the rights of women and the rights of gays and lesbians, how all of these rights gradually got incorporated into the meaning of the Equal Opportunity Clause of the Constitution. That's a very important part of our discussion, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time on that in the latter part of the course. Towards the end of the class, we're going to get into other policy questions. We're going to devote 2 lectures to foreign and defense policy, a very large, very complex set of questions. Our foreign policy institutions evolved in very important ways during World War II, that enormous war that encompassed the entire world, and the United States played such a critical role. Entering that war, we were taken by surprise when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And we had very weak foreign policy institutions that enabled the Japanese to take advantage of the United States at that time. After the war, serious efforts were made to rebuild our foreign policy institutions to make sure that would never happen again. And similarly, our defense institutions have expanded enormously as the United States has become the country that has to take responsibility for maintaining world order. Many other countries around the world defer to the United States to take the leadership in taking on challenging questions, whether it is the Soviet Union and communism up until 1990, or whether it is terrorism, which is occurring in the Middle East in contemporary times. And we're going to take a look at how our institutions function and how our leaders address these kinds of issues. And finally, we're going to look at economic and social policy. Economic policy is incredibly important because if the American economy is not growing, then we can't sustain everything else we want. We can't maintain our civil liberties. We can't maintain our civil rights. We can't defend our country from our enemies abroad. All of this depends on a robust economy. The United States has the strongest economy in the world. It is exceptional in the growth that it experienced in the 19th century and the 20th century. The United States has all of the political institutions that are needed in order to create a fantastic economy. That's what makes the United States exceptional in many, many important ways. So yes, we're going to take a look at the institutions of our government that help our political leaders make sure our economy remains on an even keel. And we're going to look at the debates over our taxation policy. Are our taxes too high or too low? Or are they badly designed? How could we make them more effective? Who should be taxed? How should they be taxed? All of these are really fascinating questions. We're going to devote 2 of our lectures to the study of economic and social policy. And in the second part, we're going to dive into the whole question of entitlements, whether it's Social Security or disability insurance or insurance for those who are unable to work and who are otherwise impoverished. All of those entitlements that are available to segments of our population that are in need. How did these institutions develop? How did this policy evolve? What are the controversies today? What does the future look like? A lot of people are concerned that we don't have the resources to maintain our entitlement policies unless we revise those policies. Our population is getting older. People can retire now at age 65 or even at age 62, and they might live to 100. It's entirely conceivable that in the course of the 21st century, a very large segment of our population will be living to the age of 100. Can we afford to give Social Security people for 35 years beyond the age of 65? If not, can we raise the age of retirement? That's a very controversial question. Nobody wants to do it. These are some of the challenges that the United States is going to face in the 21st century. And we're going to take a look at the context in which those decisions are going to have to be made. So that's a lot. We are covering a lot in this course. This is not a simple little course on American government civics 10 that you might have had as a sophomore in high school or a freshman in high school. This is a complex course that's going to explore many topics in depth, look at the latest political science research that bears on important issues, and I hope that you will join me in the course of the conversations that we're going to have. I'm going to be talking with a variety of students who have taken the course with me so that we have a conversational style throughout most of the lectures. So this is the one lecture where I just wanted to talk by myself to give you a quick overview of what it's all about. But from now on, we're going to have conversations. And of course, you'll have a teaching fellow that will be available to work with you as well. So I hope you join the course, and I hope you enjoy the opportunity to learn about the exceptional nature of American government. Our next lecture will be on the Constitution.